So listen now, this first Sunday, each Advent Sunday has a theme, and this one, if you haven't gathered already, is hope. So listen for this text from Lamentations 3, verses 19 through 24. It says, I'll never forget the trouble, the utter lostness, the taste of ashes, the poison I've swallowed. I remember it all. Oh, how well I remember the feeling of hitting the bottom. But there's one other thing I remember. And remembering this, I keep a grip on hope. God's steadfast love never ceases. God's mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. God is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I hope in God. And then in the Newer Testament from the book of Romans, chapter 4, verses 18 through 25, hoping against hope, Abraham believed that he would become the father of many nations, according to what was said by God. So numerous shall your descendants be. Abraham did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of his wife Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what God had promised. And then finally also from Romans chapter 8, verses 25 through 30. If we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it in patience. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. And God, who searches the heart, knows what is in the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that all things work together for good, for those who love God, who are called according to God's purpose. Here ends the reading. Well, I don't know if any of you did much shopping this particular Friday, last Friday. We were joking when we refer to it as Black Friday. My daughter called me up and said, "Are you going shopping this Good Friday, Dad?" And it was a slip, of course. So she and I decided we should call it Bad Friday. But anyway, I saw a cartoon of this one guy already at the service desk at a shopping mall or at a store returning something. And he said, "I would like to return 2020. It did not meet my expectations." And I think a lot of us are feeling that way. That if there was a way that we could somehow give this year back, a lot of us probably would. But it is not a bad year in many ways with which to experience Advent, because it's maybe even easier for us than usual to get in touch with the longing that the people of Israel had when the Christ came in first century Palestine. Just suffice it to say that they were in a rough position. They were in many ways on the edge of survival. Their land, which was one of the objects of the promise to Abraham, their father, that we read about. He was promised, Abraham and Sarah were promised in their old age that God was going to bless them with descendants. They hadn't had any children yet. It seemed completely impossible. But they had a son, Isaac, and that's our spiritual ancestors and the Jewish people. And the promise was, you'll be a great people and you'll have a special land that will be yours. First century Palestine, the land and the people were threatened. The Romans had taken over the country, taken over the land, and the people were on the edge of some form of annihilation or just one riot away from possibly being the victims of genocide. And that was part of their history. So they were crying out and longing for the Messiah to come to them. And a lot of us are crying out and longing for change right now. And that's my opening point. It's kind of easier this year to have that sense of, man, we need a change of some kind. We need to get past this. We need to get through this to the other side of this. You know, I was thinking about the difference between wishing and hoping. And to be honest, I realized this last week that I struggle a little bit with the notion of hope or words of hope. Not that I don't have hope, as you'll see, but so often when we talk about hope, it seems kind of flimsy to me. You know, like some nice words that we throw around. Oh, don't lose hope. And that's why I wanted to talk about the difference between a wish and a hope. It's one thing, for example, to wish that you'll have nice roses in your garden. It's a nice thought, but the kind of hope we're talking about is a matter of preparing your garden's soil, planting a rose bush, fertilizing it, taking care of it if necessary, putting a little fence around it so the rabbits can't eat it. That's more the kind of hope that we're talking about. Hope does the work of helping to bring about what you're longing to see happen. The problem for the people of Israel, and I think it's a problem that a lot of us share too, is that the Messiah, when Christ came, when Jesus came, didn't come the way they thought he was going to. They were looking for Braveheart. They wanted Mel Gibson in Braveheart for a Messiah. In fact, watch that movie sometime and think, that's the story of the gospel if Jesus had been an action figure. And a lot of them wanted an action figure for a Messiah. Someone who would come and overthrow their enemies and lead them into freedom as a nation. And instead they got Jesus. And thank God they and we did. Jesus was this amazing embodiment of divine strength, but wrapped up in amazing tenderness and gentleness. Scriptures say that the demons trembled when they saw Jesus. But anyone who was suffering, or who had been hurt, or who was cast out or left out, Jesus had nothing but kindness and tenderness for. One of the Advent and Christmas texts that talk about the coming of the Messiah refers to the Christ as Emmanuel. It's a word that means God with us. And if you're struggling today emotionally, then Advent hope can be a very, very simple message for you. And it's simply that God is with you. Advent or Christmas reminds us that God came to us and experienced life as we do. So whatever you're dealing with right now, real simple message here, but hear this, okay? God is with you. Right now, whatever you're facing, and God loves you, and God will walk with you, and maybe even if necessary, carry you. If you're in the midst of some transition or some passage or some corridor that you have to go through now, God will walk with you and make sure you get to the other side. And that's one of the best meanings, simple best meanings of Advent hope, that is, no matter how hard it is here in this valley of the shadow, that God will make sure you move through it. You don't get stuck here. As they say in 12-step programs, this too will pass. Some of you I know are really struggling with isolation right now. Hold on. We're here. God is here. This will pass. Or as Orphan Annie put it, the sun will come up tomorrow, but to go a little deeper, as Jesus put it in John 16, in the world you're going to have tribulation. But be of good cheer because I have overcome the world. I know that some people are struggling right now with the end of life, literally. Or maybe with the end of some part of life. And if so, then the word to you today is to trust. Trust that God is with you and that you'll be given everything you need to get through this, even if what you're facing is the end of life in this body. We don't talk about it a lot, but one of the basic truths of the faith is that life does not end when our bodies are done. The journey continues. And it continues and it will carry you into something that Jesus referred to as paradise, beautiful, nothing to be feared. So a simple Advent message today for you is trust. If you're on your way home, capital H, trust God will get you there. It's kind of like getting into a beautiful river with a gentle current that is leading to the ocean. Trust the current. And I wanted to just offer that very tender, simple message because I think a lot of people are struggling on a level right now where it's hard to hear much of a challenge. But the good news is that even in the midst of really difficult times, God's love does challenge us in a creative, soulful, life-giving way to not just cope with what's going on, but to hope. So if you've got it in you to hear a little more of the message, then listen to the more challenging part. First, as I said already, the Messiah did not come the way the Hebrew people, for the most part, wanted the Messiah to come. They wanted an action figure. They got gentle Jesus, who, by the way, also cleared the temple. But he didn't overthrow their enemies. He wasn't willing to use violence to bring about the change. And in essence, his whole life and teaching saying we're going to have to go way deeper than that. The transformation that Christ brings us is way deeper than simply overthrowing a regime or changing any set of external circumstances. But that first message is, so what in your life hasn't gone according to plan A? And hasn't happened the way you thought it should? Or the way you hoped it would? And what do you do when that happens? Because the problem is that a lot of the things that we hope for are good, beautiful things, dreams, goals, visions, relationships, retirement. I can't tell you how many people I have encountered for whom the so-called golden years turned out to not be so golden, or at least did not unfold. Despite all the financial plans and dreams and hopes and plans for travel, whatever, didn't happen. People had big trips planned for this year. Can't go anywhere. Or maybe that partner that you always dreamed you would do that with isn't with you anymore. And I want you to know that our faith tradition draws from this rich reality of the people of Israel at times crying out because things are not going the way they thought they were supposed to. And it's not that they were necessarily being stubborn. It was just life. And so we have the Psalms, for example, many of which start off with, "How long, God?" Or, "What's going on, God?" "This wasn't supposed to happen. What happened? Did I do something wrong? Are you punishing us? Why have you withdrawn your favor from us?" Because it feels that way. There's a Buddhist teacher named Tara Brach, for whom I have great respect. I listen to a lot of her teachings. I highly recommend her. And she said, often we need to distinguish between what she calls egoic hope versus spiritual hope, or the difference between ego consciousness and Christ consciousness. By the way, that's a term, I want you to get used to me using that term, Christ consciousness. It means having the mind of Christ, as it says in Philippians 2, having the thinking, experiencing things from the perspective of Christ, having that consciousness. That's what God is calling us to. But Tara Brach says that the difference is that egoic hope needs things to go a certain way. There's a book called Children's Letters to God. Maybe some of you have seen that before. An example is one child who wrote a letter to God and said, "Dear God, thank you for the little brother, but what I was hoping for was a puppy." You get the idea. We're always kind of have our preferences, and life doesn't always line up with what we thought we should have. I mean, that's a simple, trite, childish example, but we have our grown-up examples, don't we? And the point is that if we need things to go a certain way in order to feel okay, or in order to believe that God is blessing us, then we're in trouble. Because things don't always go the way we wish they would. And you're thinking, thank you, Reverend Obvious, for that insight. For some reason in this last year, it's really hit me that Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane would not have prayed, "God, is there any other way?" if he wasn't deep down hoping there might be. And sometimes, truth is, we have to somehow deal with things that we wish were not the case. T.S. Eliot put it this way: "I told my heart to remain still and to wait without hope, for hope would be hope for the wrong things." We all tend to hold on to things going a certain way. Nothing wrong with that. But spiritual hope comes to us when that ego-centered hope, and I don't mean ego in a negative, selfish way necessarily, just our plans, when what we wanted doesn't happen. Spiritual hope rises out of accepting and eventually embracing what is, not necessarily liking it, especially at first. We may need to grieve the loss of what we'd hoped for, sometimes for a long time. Sometimes that grief is a non-linear process that happens for the rest of your life. But at some point we realize that we need to move into, or sometimes stumble into, or limp into, or be carried by God into spiritual hope. Spiritual hope comes from looking squarely into what is, as painful or dark or disappointing as it may be, and then finding, usually just opening to it first with God's help, finding the grace to focus on what in the current reality still rings true and is still life-giving despite the disappointment. And then we renew our commitment to that, to what's true and loving and alive right now, and bringing life to others right now. And we begin to trust God in and with that and say, okay, my life's going to be about that, this. And we continue to move forward with God in this new reality. Spiritual hope does not unfold according to our timeline or our conditions. It's what Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about when he said the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. By the way, he was quoting a Unitarian preacher named Theodore Parker when he said that. Spiritual hope plays the long game and realizes that God may be up to something bigger and ultimately even more important and more beautiful for our own soul and for the world than what we thought we were doing. And so spiritual hope, Advent hope, means we find out what that is. We commit ourselves to that, to what's life-giving in our reality now. And we recalibrate what God's call is to us now. And we begin to embrace and ultimately enjoy the adventure of acting in such a way that the things we hope for most deeply will come into being in and through, to some degree, our lives. So really what I'm saying this morning is that Advent hope calls us to make a commitment. Commitment to where we are right now, and as Mother Teresa used to put it, doing what we can with what we've got where we are. A lot of us, as we've experienced 2020 together, have been saying things like, maybe this pandemic could be a wake-up call to humanity. Advent hope says, let's make it that. Let's decide it is that. To whatever degree we can be about that ourselves as individuals, as a community, let's commit ourselves to that. Even if it's just for yourself or for our church, let's start with where we are. Let's resolve to come out of this more committed to God and God's work through us than ever before. More committed to having some fun together, too. When we can get together, 2021 is going to be a party time for us as a church, if I have anything to say about it, once we start gathering together. But hang in with just me for just a little while longer here. My mentor, one of my favorite preachers, Gordon Cosby, whom I've talked about often. Many years ago, he was talking about the reality of climate change. This was probably 25 years ago. And I heard him say this. He said, we will not embrace the changes that we need to make as humankind unless we have what he called a savage moment of recognition that now is the time when we need to commit ourselves to making the changes that we must make, whether someone or anyone else follows us or not. I was going to hold up that globe right now, but it's already on the other side of the sanctuary. I kicked it by mistake. But I think it's time for us to make that commitment. Say this earth is a precious gift. We're all a part of the world. We're not rulers of it. We're here to cultivate the garden of creation so that it might flourish. We have hope because we and increasing numbers of people love this world more than we love short-sighted, self-centered greed and personal profit. We believe that corporate greed is no match for God's love, and we're committing ourselves to living in such a way that this world gets lovingly handed down to the generations to come. We will do whatever it takes, including radically and joyfully changing our lifestyles and our habits of consumption and travel if necessary. It's not about being the ecology police. It's about loving the world enough to do whatever it takes to save it and to save ourselves. The racial justice activist, Ruby Sales, says we have to be clear about what we love, or as clear about what we love as about what we hate, if we want real change. So I'm going to close with a story that embodies Advent hope, the kind of commitment that I'm talking about. In Washington, D.C., a number of years ago, there was a 14-year-old boy who was shot and killed by another teenager in order to prove himself to a gang. At the trial, the victim's mother sat until the end, and when the 14-year-old was sentenced and convicted of killing her son, she stood up slowly in the courtroom and stared at him, and she said, "I'm going to kill you." And then the youth was taken away to serve several years in a juvenile facility. After about the first 6 months, the mother of the slain child went to visit her son's killer. He'd been living in the streets, this kid who killed her son, before this happened. And he had no one in his life. No visitors. He had not had one visitor. And she came and they visited for a while, and they talked. And at the end of her visit, she gave him some money for snacks at the facility and said, "I want to come and see you again." And she started to visit more regularly and would bring him food and some small gifts. And near the end of his 3-year sentence, she asked him what he was going to do when he got out, what plans he had. And he was confused and uncertain, so she offered to set him up in a job with a friend of hers who had a factory. And then she asked him where he was going to live and found out that he had nowhere to go. So she offered him temporary use of a spare room in her house. And for 8 months he lived there and ate her food and worked at the job that she had gotten him. And then one evening she called him into the living room to talk, and she sat down next to him and she said, "Do you remember in the courtroom when I said that I was going to kill you?" "I sure do," he replied. "Well, I did," she said. "I didn't want the boy who killed my son for no reason to remain alive in this world. I wanted that boy gone. And that's why I started to visit you and to bring you things. And that's why I got you the job and let you live here in my house. Because I wanted God to change you. And that old boy, he's gone now, isn't he? And so I want to ask you now, since my son is gone, and the boy who killed him is gone, if you'll stay here. I've got room, and I love you, and I'd like to adopt you, if you'll let me." And she became the mother of her son's killer. It's a true story. The mother he never had. That's Advent hope. And I'll just close with Barbara Kingsolver's poem. She says, here's what I've decided. The very least you can do in your life is figure out what you hope for. And the most you can do is live inside that hope. Not admire it from a distance, but live right in it, under its roof. What I want is so simple I almost can't say it. I want elementary kindness. Our closing song will be a song of mine that a lot of you know well. Dream God's Dream. And may we all catch a fresh vision of God's dream for our lives, how God wants to use us to change things in the direction of love and healing in this world. That's why there's hope.